The Apostle Paul, who wrote this letter to the Christians in Ephesus, was a Jew. He was a Jew, but he could sum up his ministry like this: hashtag Gentile lives matter. Now, that wasn't because he didn't care about Jews. He was a Jew. He loved Jews. But his main ministry was recognizing a great injustice. He was overwhelmed with compassion that everybody, all peoples of the world, could hear about Jesus. So he writes this letter to a church made up of a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. That's people who are not Jews. Which is why it's such a good passage this morning to look at, to think about this issue, Black Lives Matter. However, I do want to point out there is one big difference between, as it were, Paul's Gentile Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter today. And that big difference is that the Jews were not the privileged race of the Roman Empire. So it's not quite the same. For the analogy to work, for it to match completely, Paul would have had to be a white Roman writing to, say, Romans or Greeks and telling them that Jews matter. So it's not quite the same, but anyway, Ephesians 2 verses 11 to 22 is a wonderful passage to look at, because here Paul gives us the antidote to racism, the only hope: faith in Jesus Christ and his death on the cross. Now, interestingly, here in Ephesians, the Apostle Paul does not view the world in racial terms. Instead, he divides all the world into two religious groups: Jews and Gentiles. That is, Jews who worship the Lord and non-Jews who don't. But having pointed out that division, he then says that Jesus came to make us all one, that naturally human beings are divided from one another, but Jesus came to unite us. He has destroyed the barrier between us, and he did that by dying on the cross and rising again. Through the cross, Jesus has reconciled us both to God and to one another through his death on the cross, as Paul puts it in verse 16. So it cannot be simpler. The only complete answer, the only deep enough answer to the question of racism is Jesus. Now, that is according to Paul. That's both the Apostle Paul and also our deacon Paul as well. And I realise that is quite a claim to make. So we're going to return to that claim at the end of the service. But first of all, let's see three practical outworkings of what Paul says in Ephesians 2. He says, if the gospel of Jesus Christ is true, then these three things follow. Number one, we have one new humanity. That's in verse 15. Christ's purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. Now that means that the gospel is not about assimilation. When I become a Christian, I join a new culture. A Jew becomes a Christian. A Gentile becomes a Christian. Paul did not say, for example, to a Greek or a Roman, you have to become a Jew first in order to become a Christian. No. In fact, most of the New Testament is Paul arguing about precisely this. People didn't have to take on all the cultural trappings and somehow sort of become a Jew culturally in order to then believe in Jesus. So this is not assimilation. And that means here at church today, we must not expect people to become white British culturally so that they can become Christians. Now, this is a real blind spot, especially for Brits, I think in particular because of the legacy of the British Empire. Without realising it, we so often see British Christianity as the kind of default position. So that not we're naturally prejudiced against other cultures, but we just think this is the normal one, the kind of default standard version of Christianity. So, for example, maybe aspects of Jamaican culture are a bit sort of lowbrow and not academic enough for good evangelical Bible-based British Christianity. But if church is God's great laboratory where he's kind of genetically engineering this one new humanity, we should see that expressed in all areas of church life. For example, let's look at our leadership. I'm really pleased to say as a church that our diaconate does reflect the diversity of our local community. Of course, in the past, in Akinola, a previous assistant pastor, we had a Nigerian minister here too. All of that makes me wonder what my successor, what nationality he will be. Now, notice therefore that Paul did not say that Jesus came to turn black people white or white people Asian or whatever. No, his purpose was to make a new humanity, a new global race, and one that includes people from all backgrounds, South America or Africa or Asia, and yes, even Europe. And because Christianity is not about assimilation, it means that we don't want our church to be colorblind either. Can you imagine how boring that would be if at church we all tried to be the same, all mixed together like a tin of paint so that color doesn't matter because we're all a sort of dirty grey, all the same color. No, that'd be awful. Instead, we want to be a panda church. Don't know whether you've heard that image before. Panda bears that come from China. The thing about panda bears is that they are not a uniform factory grey. Pandas are black and white and Asian. So there we go, RLBC, a panda church. That's what we want. Whatever background you come from, we want you to be proud of all that is good about your heritage, and that's including white British people too. RLBC, black and white and Asian. But secondly, in verses 17 to 18, Paul then tells us something that might shock us a bit. He then says, all cultures are not equal. Jesus came and preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. So Paul says, and that may shock you, all human cultures are not equal. All human beings are equal because we're all created in God's image, but that doesn't mean that all cultures are equal. See, Paul says, although both groups become one in Christ Jesus, he is still happy to compare the two. He says the Jews were nearer to God, and the Gentiles were far away. And therefore, the gospel does not say that all cultures are the same. When I become a Christian, I hope I or you or whoever are still able to evaluate their culture according to the gospel. Yes, there is much we can learn from all cultures, but that doesn't mean that they're all equal. The gospel critiques how we live in all situations. I can't excuse sin by saying, well, that's just how we do it where I come from. No one gets a free pass. Yes, of course, we must reject assimilation, as we've seen, but we also must reject a kind of radical pluralism that basically means that church is just separate groups. So we come to church to worship God, but we stay in our groups because we don't want to change. We just want to stay exactly the same in our groups. No. Our church wants to be led by Jesus Christ through his word, the Bible, which means that we're not afraid to critique any culture using the teaching of the Bible. But, and this is where we must be really careful, this is especially where Black Lives Matter kicks in. See, when I say we put all culture under the microscope of the Bible, I mean all culture, including white British culture too, maybe especially. And I say that because the problem is that your own culture is the hardest one to see and evaluate. Because it's kind of like the air you breathe. You take it for granted. So yes, you can criticize other cultures, but it's really hard to evaluate critically your own. So it may not be that we're being overtly racist, but probably we're not allowing the Bible to critique those parts of our culture, our way of doing things, that we just take for granted, that we assume. Like the clip we saw at the beginning of the service where Sephi puts a brown plaster on Callum's white finger. Things like that wake us up to the fact that, oh yeah, actually, we're kind of assuming lots of things as standard white culture, in this country at least. We tend to view the world from our own perspective. We have glasses, which means that we just assume our culture is the normal, standard way of doing things. And that means we have to work really hard at studying the Bible to be able to let the Bible evaluate everything, all cultures. For example, I often chuckle when I see, maybe in a children's storybook, a picture depicting Noah's Ark. You've probably seen the kind of thing. It always makes me laugh. For a start, in the original story of Genesis, there are 14 of all the clean animals. There's only pairs, the unclean animals. But that's just for a start. The thing that makes me really laugh when I see the pictures going 2 by 2 into the ark is that they're always in a queue. Just how odd is that? It's as if elephant is turning to giraffe and saying, "After you, sir." No, you were first. We wouldn't want anarchy. So similarly, we must be really careful how we read the Bible too, and notice exactly what Paul says here. He judges us by how far we are from God, not how far we are from polite white British culture. We don't judge black or Asian culture by white standards. No, we judge white and black, whatever culture, by the Bible. Even though that's hard to do, it takes work. It takes a lot of grace and self-awareness to do that. It's not easy to look at your own culture honestly and admit which bits are good and which bits need to change. But thirdly, Paul says, all peoples need Christ. In verses 14 to 17. For he, that's Jesus himself, is our peace, who has made the true groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. See, although Paul is able to talk about the Jews being nearer and the Gentiles far away, he still says all of them need to be reconciled to God. They all need to be put right with God by Jesus. And so culture is normal. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I hope that all, as I've said, all people who come to RLBC remain proud of their culture, wherever they grew up, including white people too. However, we must never forget that culture and background so often divides us. And that's why Jesus came, to make the two groups one, to deal with these issues. And therefore, church should be a place where cultures are welcomed and celebrated. But at the same time, it's one where we only find true unity by believing in Jesus. Racism is so difficult to address, isn't it? Precisely because it cuts across all peoples and across all time. Some of us experience that so much more acutely than others. So how do we put that right when we experience it in different ways? And a lot of it is to do with history that goes back centuries, never mind generations. How can you put right problems that you didn't start? I'm not saying that as an excuse to kind of sweep racism under the carpet. Far from it. My point I'm trying to make is racism is a really, really complex issue. There are no simple answers to this that you can just sort of do in a moment. Somehow you need to put all these things together. No, there needs to be a way for people to say sorry for their wrong attitudes, but also somehow to put right the wrongs of the past. And then there needs to be a way for people to forgive wrongs done to them, even when some of that injustice maybe originated hundreds of years ago. There needs to be a way to draw a line under past sins so that we can move on, but somehow do that in a way that doesn't imply that things are sort of ignored or swept under the carpet. Now, how is it possible to do all those things at once? Well, I hope it won't surprise you to hear that is what Ephesians 2 is all about. That faith in the cross of Jesus Christ is the only way to do all those things together at the same time. The only way. Now that is quite a claim, and therefore I need to justify that. But before I do that, before I come back and justify that audacious claim, let's return to the conversation that we're having with Paul, and let's chat with Paul a bit about how we can practically apply this kind of stuff. When we planned this service, and Paul and I were chatting about it, one thing Paul really stressed to me, he said, John, all this stuff is great, but you must make sure you make it absolutely clear that the only way to deal with racism is through Jesus Christ. So what I want to do now is just finish by returning to that audacious claim. And I want to speak to you now, particularly if you're not a Christian. I imagine if you're not a Christian watching this, you might be thinking, well, all these practical suggestions you've made, we don't really need the church for them. You don't need the church to educate yourself about racism. You can watch these clips or read these books. You don't need the church to engage with political protests. In fact, more than that, you might even be thinking, surely the church, mainly through colonialism, surely the church is part of the problem. So you might be thinking, oh, all this Jesus stuff, the church, let's get rid of that. Let's just tack racism without the church. Why this PR drive for Jesus? So I want to finish by addressing those questions directly. And the first thing I want to say in response to that is I want to acknowledge, sadly, the church has not lived up to her ideals. It brings me personally great sadness. You know, when I read, for example, things written by the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa trying to justify apartheid and similar things in the southern states of America. Really, really sad. Or closer to home, a couple of years ago in this church, we looked at the scandal of how the Windrush generation were treated when they attended churches here in London. There is much still wrong with the church. We have a long way to go, as Paul alluded to. But before you dismiss the church, I urge you to just consider these things, these alternatives, right from the off. If we reject Christianity completely, straight away you come up with a big problem. Why is racism wrong? If you have no religious background, what moral reasons are you giving to reject racism? Science can't help us. Biology is good. Biology tells us that it shows clearly that there is only really one human race. So it's not, strictly speaking, scientifically accurate to talk about races. There is just one human race. All we see are genetic variations between various people. So that helps a bit. But surely evolution encourages us to look for the survival advantages in those differences. So from a purely scientific point of view, there shouldn't be anything wrong to say, well, maybe different genetic differences are better than others, shouldn't it? Current Western society is against racism, that's a good thing. But I put to you, it's based on the Christian doctrine that we're all created in God's image. If you're going to remove those religious assumptions, what philosophical basis have you got to say that racism is wrong? And there's more. Okay, you say, well, maybe, I'll think about that, but we don't need the church to educate ourselves. Well, why don't we just do that? I'll just read some books. I don't need to go to church and hear about Jesus. Well, yes, as myself and Paul have both said, education is good. Read those books, listen to those podcasts. But education doesn't change human hearts. It's not enough. On its own, education will not stop racism. For example, you could read Jonathan Haidt's book. It's called The Righteous Mind. The subtitle is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Nobody really changes their minds about things like morality or politics through education alone. In fact, current research shows that we tend to post-rationalize our gut instincts. It's why it's so frustrating. If you're arguing with somebody about this and you kind of give them your killer knockdown argument, your gotcha moment with your information, and you really want to win the argument, all they tend to do is respond by saying, yeah, no, actually, what you say agrees with my point of view. And that is so frustrating because education is good, but it's not enough. We don't fundamentally change our opinion over the things just through education. Something else is needed. All right, you think, okay, well, maybe politics, if we protest and get the government to change the law, that's what I need to do. And you don't need the church for that either. Well, isn't that the same as education? It's a good thing. I'd encourage you to get involved in the political responses to Black Lives Matter. But again, it's not enough. Political pressure leads to changes in the law, which that helps, but only to a limited degree. Because that's the way laws work. Laws can only limit how bad we are. They can't actually make us good. Laws moderate to some degree our external behavior, but they don't change our thinking. They don't change our attitude. They don't change what goes on inside. They just stop us being as bad as we might be without the laws. They don't make us good. And more than that, there is a common side effect of an emphasis on law, which can be really toxic. People who focus on laws very quickly tend to become very self-righteous. You probably recognize that already. Of course, the greatest example of this were the lawyers in Jesus' day, way back in the Gospels. They were no longer interested in being good people per se. They were more interested in other people seeing how good they were because they kept the law. Well, it's the same today. The impression then is that racists, and not just those who are overtly racist, maybe those who are indifferent to the effects of the social structures that encourage racism and racial inequality. The impression we can give is that people like that, them, the racist people, they are morally inferior to us. Now that kind of thinking is very dangerous, because those of us who are denouncing racism very quickly become inherently superior. We feel better. We lose that sense of a common fallen humanity, that this is a problem we all have. And can you see the irony there? Because that prejudice is exactly the same prejudice that causes racism in the first place. No, instead, what we need to do is we need to look at racism as one virulent, destructive manifestation of something that all of us have a problem with to some degree. And if we forget that, the only way to address people complicit in racism is just to denounce them more and more loudly. And that has little effect. You've probably seen and experienced it. That just tends to aggravate our divisions. You see, if you go the political route on its own, and as I say, it's a good thing to be involved in, but if that's all you do, it very quickly leads to scapegoating, as evidenced in the cancel culture so common on social media today. We want, don't we? We all want to join the good people, denouncing all the bad people, so we kind of pile on. But as I've said, that way ultimately won't solve anything. Instead, what we need to do is admit that we're all part of the problem and that Jesus is the only solution. Because that's what Ephesians 2 is all about. Don't have time to explain it all in detail. Please ask questions. But Paul is saying that Jesus is the scapegoat for us. That all that's wrong with the world, all the filth of racism is poured onto Jesus. And he takes all the punishment that we deserve. He is the scapegoat so that we can be reconciled with God, but also so that we can be reconciled with each other. So that we can say sorry to God, so that we can say sorry to one another. So that all the wrong that has been done to us can be treated seriously and put right. So that we can forgive others for the way we've been treated. Jesus really is the only answer. Now, if you want a real-life illustration of this, you're thinking, well, that's a theoretical belief in Jesus. Show me, prove it to me, show me that it actually works. Take a look at our church. Take a look at Rayners Baptist Church. It's certainly not perfect, as Paul has alluded to, and as I agree. We've got a long way to go. But I put to you that the church is the one place in the UK where we've got a long way to go, but we are making really good progress on this issue. And I suggest to you, nowhere else is really doing as well as the church. Because it's easy to bash the church these days, but can you think of any other social institution that is reconciling in a genuine way that really brings out integration? Anywhere else come close? Before the lockdown, pubs and football terraces, yes, they show diversity, but that's not real integration, is it? It's the same at work. Maybe your company is good. It can tick all the boxes, all the quotas, but I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about merely representation. I'm talking about integration, the kind of communities where you welcome people into each other's homes, where you have intermarriage, where you share meals together, again, in each other's homes. You don't just talk about race in a dispassionate way. You actually do things together with different cultures. And you do the very kind of things together that cultures fall out with one another. I put to you that Black Lives Matter and that church really shows it and seeks to live it out. Because Jesus Christ is the only answer deep enough to really genuinely deal with racism. Now I'm going to stop there, but I realise that you've probably got lots of questions. We probably today raised as many questions as we've answered. So I urge you to take it further if you want to find out more about how you can believe in Jesus, what it means to put racism right by trusting in Jesus. We'd love to hear from you. Send in a comment on Facebook or email, go to our website, there's contact details. We'd love to talk to you and explain more what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what it means to believe in him. Equally, maybe you've got questions about racism, lots of questions. Maybe you disagree with something that I said or Paul said and you want to talk about it further. Again, send in your questions. Myself and Paul, we've been talking to each other about creating a kind of a safe space, a community or a place where we can just carry on this conversation. If you've got suggestions about a really good way to do that, send them in. We'd love to hear from you. Difficult issues like this get worse when we don't talk about them. So let's talk. Join in the conversation. Now, there is only one hymn we can finish this service with. It was written in 1772 by a former slave owner. It's probably the most famous hymn ever written. But what is so troubling about the story of John Newton's conversion is that it took him so long after becoming a Christian to turn his back on the slave trade. To begin with, as a Christian, he seemed unbothered by the plight of the Africans that he was treating literally as his cargo. So sad. And the problem was that John Newton was blinded by the culture of his own age, just as I'm sure we are today. And it took years and years understanding the gospel and help from his young friend William Wilberforce for Newton to recognize racism for the evil that it is. And therefore now, if you are a Christian, do not sing this hymn just as a sort of a fond recollection of the day you trusted in Jesus. No, I want you to sing it as a prayer that the Holy Spirit will keep working on your heart the way he kept working on John Newton's heart, and open your eyes to see how the gospel applies to new areas of your life, especially this one of racism. Because as John Newton famously said, I am not what I ought to be. I am not what I want to be. I am not what I hope to be in another world. But still, I am not what I used once to be. And by the grace of God, I am what I am. So let's sing together, Amazing Grace.